Good morning. I'm Martin Aguirre, and as indicated earlier, I'm the CEO of Workforce Solutions of the South Plains. So everybody says, what are you doing with globalization, and what are you doing in 15 counties of West Texas? And what opinions do you have regarding workplace issues? Well, there are a lot of universal issues that deal with workplace ethics and what we're doing with our workforces and how we develop workforces, and so much of it has to do just with economics, and that we deal with the least, hardest to place, hardest to serve populations. We deal with academicians, we deal with every strata that there is in our workforce. But one of the things that this taught me, because I know that when Dr. Ferguson called and said, would you like to talk about this particular topic? And I thought about it and thought, well, we get ethical dilemmas all day long. It's one of the things that I've done I've been here 8 years, but I've been in workforce issues for about 42 years. This is all I've ever done. So you're going, okay, he's pretty tracked into one particular cycle. I started doing this in 1971, right out of college. So it's been a fairly long time, but at the same time, a very beneficial time, and I've really enjoyed it. And not having worked internationally, but worked at the level as a state administrator, I have overseen most of the offices in Texas and quite a few employees, and we've dealt with a lot of issues relating to our very own personnel and how we make decisions. We started talking about some of the movement of, I worked in Austin way too many years, and I know some people can appreciate working in Austin for all that time with the state government. When we started talking about luring electronic companies to Texas, and what could we do to incentivize their movement, even cross-country or from overseas, and you start talking about, well, what do we have to offer? There was a quote that I pulled from the literature research that was written in Harvard Business Review that said, great global organizations can't be built only from solid ethical foundations. Ethics must be global, not local, and we have to adopt global standards. We talk about cultural ethics, we talk about how do you treat workforces in the United States versus Asia versus India versus other parts of the country, and you're saying, well, you adapt to the local culture. Yes and no. If your ethics in a corporation are going to be global, they've got to be across the whole spectrum. It appears to be something that you should do situationally with cultural ethics, but if it's appropriate or had been appropriate or accepted practice, let's go with accepted practice, in a foreign country to bribe, for example, local officials to get business. You pay $2 billion and you get $65 billion worth of business. That sounds like a good return. It's not appropriate here, as you can ask some of our Wall Street managers what you could do with kickbacks and bribes and other things, and where they end up. You've got to look at it and say, okay, but the corporation has to take a stand and say, we have to treat everyone the same. We have to do everything alike. We've got to have a moral compass. And I think that's where we talk about, okay, what are the ethics of the company? It could be simple. Most of us were born and raised in a Christian tradition here in the United States, and so you look at it and say, okay, it could be the 10 Commandments. That's a moral compass, it's a cultural value, it's an ethical value. There's things there's do and don't. It could have been all that wonderful, the parables of Jesus. It could have been Confucius. Where did we learn our ethics? We learned them from those tales. Where do we learn them? What can we do with that type, and how do we apply it? About 5% of the human resources managers in this country have been surveyed. Of the number surveyed, 5% said they can't guarantee to ever hire an ethical person. They don't know how to measure ethics until they see it in action. There's no psychological assessment tests. There's some that will tell you some things, but not everything. How does one act day after day, week after week, and do it in an ethical situation? Is it something simple? I think simple, maybe. Yesterday we were just dealing with lawyers. I know that's always an interesting dynamic in itself, dealing with lawyers, because they always want to compromise, they want to negotiate, they want to do all these things. And yet, our position as a company was that in this particular instance, we had all the research, we had all the backup, and we determined we were right. So why should I compromise? They were having a hard time with that because I told them, I said, we're right. There's no two ways about this. And so we're dealing with a state agency who's much bigger than we are. And we're talking to them about this situation. They want to compromise. They want to give us their opinion, and we're looking at it saying, well, we've got outside experts, we've got auditors, we've got other people that have already said they corroborated our position. So no, we're not compromising. You've got some companies, take the Apple Corporation when they were talking about all their workers in China. There was a big dilemma over how to change what they were doing there with the workforces, because they had actually outsourced it all. It wasn't their workforce per se, but they were paying for it. So were they going to hide behind that little cloak that says, okay, this is something I'm paid for, but I don't have to do, so somebody else is responsible for that? Well, as the primary funder, they're basically responsible for that. They can make things happen and change by virtue of the funding. So something to look at and say, okay, let's talk about that. But the company leaders have to do something else, because they're not in every decision, every day, everywhere. They've got to set a culture within the company, within the structure, within the corporation that says this is the way we behave. This is the way that we do things. So the first thing most of us do, all of us sitting here probably, have seen what is in place for our organizations as a code of conduct, ethical standards. What can you do and not do? Can you do business with your spouse? In my business, you don't do business with your spouse. You can't do business with anyone that has a financial interest in our company. I know in the federal government, my younger daughter works for the Commerce Department International Trade Association. They've got a nice big code of conduct that says, she's not going to do this and that. They even put in numeric values for some of the things that they do and don't do. So how you behave. Every employer wants somebody that's honest, and everybody wants somebody that's, making the right choices and doing those types of things. But where does all that start? And it still starts at home. It still starts in the schools, in the education process, academic standards. When we talk about, just cheating, look at all the scandals that have been erupted over the country and over cheating test scores and things, even in the school districts. You look at what the education agencies measure and say, well, we've got a lot of, if we see patterns of behavior. Same thing when we're making ethical choices, though, because who's to tell us what's right and wrong? But over the years, we've developed standards ethical standard with the precedents we've set in making our decision process. As a state administrator, I worked the unemployment insurance program. Always a great program to work if you've never tried it. The program had to determine whose fault it was you were out of work when you came in, if we were going to pay you benefits or not. And there were precedent decisions that had been made over the 50 years. And so we were looking at patterns. And there were things that some folks will look at and say, well, was that really right or not? If you are out of work through no fault of your own, no problem. If you were out of work because your employer said that you weren't meeting his performance standard, the question was why? And the choice that a claims examiner had to make, or decision he had to make when talking to you, if in fact you were out of work by not meeting the employer's performance standard, but you were capable of meeting the employer's performance standard, now there's a really relative abstract decision to make. Were you capable? You're interviewing somebody for 15 minutes and you're going to decide whether they're capable or not. Then it was your fault. You could have done it. And therefore, the state of Texas was not going to pay you unemployment benefits. But on the other side of that, if it was determined that you were working 110%, doing all you could, but you were incapable of meeting the employer performance standard, then you were awarded benefits because you were out of work through no fault of your own. Choices, precedents, looking at what has been set up, what's right and what's wrong. We all have things that we do daily that we choose right and wrong by just what our experiences are. And we have to go with that. So it is something that when we look at setting up standards, what a manager's influence is on all this stuff, we always say that the manager plays a major role in setting the standards for the office, setting a standard for the company, and it's the leadership role to not only set the standard, but model the standard, so that the other workers can say, okay, this is what is acceptable, what's not acceptable. They know how far you can take a decision, where you need the collaborations, where you need the decision process to go. I know that if you're in the business world and you take little courses like statistical business decision making, and you're saying, well, can I always do something because I'm 100% right? You're never going to be 100% right. And even as adamant as I was a while ago about, we were right. But if you don't do something, you've got to set a standard that says, as long as I'm within this reasonable standard of being right, then it's a good risk. I tell my staff if we're at about 85% that we're making a good choice, then we're going to move on it. Just because if not to, we would be just stuck in the mud all the time. So we have to make choices about those things. So we do have a code of ethics. We do have it written. We do practice it. We do train on it every year. We do model it. We do have things that we tell other people. And the other part of that, and this is the part that a lot of people don't like in the workplace, is you also have to not only audit it, you have to discipline on it. If you find an employee that's not doing something that's ethical, you are going to have to address that. And the others in the workplace, whether it's 10, 20,000, I think one time I had a division with 5,000 people, they want to see that the code of ethics was in fact being enforced if there was this violation that everyone knew of. If you have whistleblowers, I know in government we have whistleblower standards, whistleblower protection. Something has to be done with the information. Somebody brought forth a complaint because they feel like it was an ethical violation or they feel it was illegal. And the laws are, of course, like one of the giant arbiters of what's right and wrong. Those are supposedly societally passed by Congress that works. And they want to see that you're enforcing that. If they see you not doing that, then your ethical dilemma becomes one of your company sliding. Because people will take it upon themselves then to do that. And I know that something as simple as one of our employees taking too much time on the telephone. Everybody goes, well, that's minor thing. I have employees complain all the time. So-and-so spent all her whole day on the telephone talking to her friends and doing something else and didn't work. So you have to address that. You have to take that as a personnel situation and go talk to them. So the code of conduct now includes statements about the use of cell phones and personal electronic devices in the workplace. I mean, I didn't have to worry about telephones and smartphones, 20, 30 years ago because not everyone had one. Just like you didn't have to worry about them in the classroom. And so it is something that we all will look at, train on the standards, advise your employees on the ethical issues and violations, process potential violations confidentially or anonymously, do evaluations on the conduct, and then have a systemic way of dealing with the violators if you find it to be so. And again, not just in the U.S., not just in Texas, not just in the 15 counties of West Texas. It has to be something that's done within the entire organization, whether that organization is small or large. And it has to be. It begins at home, begins with the individual manager, and it'll take it from there.